it's just wild. It's crazy. It's like, why did God choose this way? I think it's a mystery for us to discover. But this dynamic of death and resurrection, it's these two elements that will always be in our lives. If you are following Jesus, death and resurrection is God's process. As good as dead. Welcome back to another manifesto, guys. Daniel here. So glad you could join me. Yeah, Abraham, in Hebrews, it says that Abraham was as good as dead. Think about that contradiction. Like, you think that God doesn't want death, right? Absolutely. And he defeated death. He overcame death, right? Jesus went there. He conquered those places. But God's processes for us as people, as followers of Him, He said, die to yourself. He has a pathway for us. And I think it's interesting in the life of Abraham, God got him to a place, and even that verbiage is amazing, as good as dead, to where he couldn't fulfill the promise himself. To, if you know the life of Abraham, God spoke to him, you're going to become a great nation. He left all that he knew to follow the word of the Lord, and God gave him all these promises. And in the span of 25 years, from the time that God spoke to him about his son to 25 years, that was God's process to make Abraham as good as dead. God has a process for us to walk with Him in such a manner to where the things that we feel that we could accomplish, even the things that He's promised us, are incapable. We can't do them. He brings us to a breaking point to where we fully surrender, and He is the only hope. He wants to be our only hope. He wants there to be no other hope but Him. And this is why it's as good as dead. Guys, if you feel as good as dead, maybe you're in a good place, because only God can resurrect you. And this is a picture, like, guys, Abraham became a picture of Jesus. That just as Jesus was as good as dead, then the glory of the Father raised Him from the dead and raised Him to the highest place. And this is what God does. Time and time again, we see that this is the dynamic of believing God and trusting His voice and His word and His promises, that He takes us into a barren land. He takes us through the wilderness, and He leads us into a land of promise. It talks about how Abraham, he obeyed God. It says, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called out to the place which he would receive as inheritance. So there's promises that God gave him, right? And he went out not knowing where he was going. First of all, that's the first death. You're leaving somewhere, going somewhere, not knowing where you're going, and having one thing alone: God's voice. God spoke, I'm gonna do it. And so God takes them into this wilderness, really, and he dwells in the land of promise, intense, and the hope of that was that God would build a city. And we see God hundreds of years later fulfilling that, where the very same place that Abraham dwelt was now occupied by the children of Israel, by his inheritance. And so the promise was fulfilled centuries later, but it was the faith of Abraham that established and sowed into that land far before there was even a son that could reproduce the seed of Abraham. So look at how God calls us by His voice into lands unknown, into places where we feel and know that we cannot accomplish it. And I just feel like this is God's process for us as followers of Jesus, of Yeshua, the only one. We hear His voice and obey Him, and He takes us through the stripping to where we become as good as dead, and to where only His goodness would fulfill the promise. And so I just want to encourage us, if you're going through a stripping, know that God is testing your faith. Granted, God is establishing you on His word, that when you go through this testing, He's testing the word. He always tests His word. Without the testing of the word, we don't really know if we believe. But God gives us His word so that our hearts can know where we're at, and will we come to the point as good as dead, where you can't fulfill it. Because this is where God gets all the glory, where we say it wasn't not by might, not by power, but by the Spirit. And the Spirit makes the word alive. It says it was the glory of the Father. It wasn't Jesus Himself. It was glory of the Father. In Romans 6 it says that raised Jesus back from the dead. It wasn't from Himself. And this is the beauty of the Trinity, that the Father raised Jesus from the dead, right? And in the life of Paul, he recognizes that fellowshipping with God is dual. It's in the fellowship of His suffering and the resurrection power. And so there's these dual dynamics that God is constantly leading us through. And so whatever season you're on, if you've just had a promise fulfilled, praise God. Pray for someone who is going through the crucifixion. Pray for someone that is going through the testing, because we share in each other's faith, and we should be encouraging one another to go all in believing God for His promise. Guys, you cannot fulfill the promises of God. Listen. You cannot fulfill the promises of God. You cannot fulfill it's on God to fulfill the promises of God. And He strips us from all of our man's knowledge, man's wisdom, and our own ability to make it happen. That's why we have to be as good as dead. So now that His Spirit can come and quicken us and empower us and raise us from the dead, and He fulfills it all. The good news is that God does all the work, and He brings us He wants to bring us into that threshold of faith where we fully believe Him. God who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did. So things that aren't existent, things that aren't present, He already calls them. He already sees the end from the beginning. And that's why He gives us His promise, because He sees it, and He's looking for those that will believe and go through that process. And so I just want to encourage you guys, if you feel as good as dead, you're in a good place. If you feel like you can't fulfill what God has spoken, good. Now rest. Rest in the hope of God bringing life. Rest in the hope of His Spirit. But in these moments, it's an act of faith. It's an act of faith. It's an act of faith, and it's an act of faith. Act of faith, and it's an act of faith. It's both. It's when we believe God, it's not passive. It's not just like, oh, God's gonna do it, I don't do anything. No, you're sitting on the edge of your seat awaiting for this promise, because you know you can't do it. And so be encouraged. If you can't do it, fully rely on God, rest in His promise, and enjoy this time. Enjoy the crushing, because there will be fulfillment. There will be joy on the other side. But this is where we build our history with God. This is where even Jesus calls us into nearness with Him. This is where He calls us to walk with Him closely and have fellowship with Him. So don't miss out on the fellowship when you feel as good as dead. There's life coming. This is the promise. This is the promise. There's resurrection life coming. If you see some people as good as dead around you, just encourage a brother or sister and stand with them in faith. We're here to be an army together. And if there's something that you even currently are believing for as a promise, just comment down below, and we'll just stand in agreement with one another. We'll pray for one another and believe God to fulfill those things. We are a united people. We are Jesus Manifesto. We are here to see the glory of God manifest in one another's lives, and see how God's kingdom could come through a people submitted into the Lordship of Jesus. Well, thank you guys for joining me again. Subscribe below, be part of the fam, and I'll see you in the next vid. Peace. Bless God, bless you, bless those around you. Hey, oh, guess what? If you're next to somebody right now, pray for them. Do that. Why don't you do that? Call to action. Let's go. Straight up. Pray for them. Pray for a promise they're believing for. Yeah, I think it'll be good.